This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So we're going to move now to discussing global developments, especially within international organizations. For this session, we have two people Skyping in, so just bear with me for a moment.
Hello.
Hi, Lee. Hi, welcome.
Thank you. You're early.
Yes, we're here. Just bear with me a moment, and we're going to bring Corinne Lewis online as well. I love Skype. It's a miracle of mine. Well, as long as it works. So far we have you, Lee.
Hello.
Hello, Corinne, welcome.
Thank you.
Corinne, welcoming Corinne. So we have Lee Swepston as well, we have Corinne Lewis, and we have Julian Burger. And we're opening our discussion now on global developments, especially in international organizations. I'd like to invite each of our speakers to have 10 minutes to share with us some insights from their chapters and some ideas about research going forward. I'll introduce each of them now and then invite them to speak. So first we're going to have Dr. Julian Burger, who isn't here in person. He's an associate fellow here at the Human Rights Consortium at the School of Advanced Study. He's also visiting professor at the Human Rights Center of the University of Essex. He has significant experience working for the UN and human rights issues. For 20 years, he was head of the Indigenous Peoples and Minorities Program at the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So welcome to Julian. Next to speak we'll have Mr. Lee Swepston, who is visiting professor at the, we'll get to read back in a moment, at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of the University of Lund in Sweden, and consultant on human rights and international labor law. He was an official of the ILO for 34 years. Hello, Corinne, are you with us still?
I am.
Okay, we just had a bit of background. Okay, going back to Mr. Swepston's introduction. He's an official of the ILO for 34 years. His posts included Chief of the Equality and Employment Branch, Director of the Department of Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, and Senior Advisor on Human Rights. He has written numerous books and articles on various aspects of human rights and international labor law, including in relation to indigenous and tribal peoples. And then finally we have Dr. Corinne Lewis, who is a partner at the Brussels-based law firm Lex Justice. She practices in the area of business and human rights and specializes in the rights of indigenous peoples and minorities. She provides legal advice, consultation, and training to a range of clients, including law firms, multinational companies, and international and non-governmental organizations. So I'd like to first invite Julian to present to us a bit of insight from his chapter, From Outsiders to Center Stage, 3 Decades of Indigenous Peoples' Presence at the United Nations.
Well, we're in a funny situation. I can see you, Lee, but you can't see me.
In a moment you will.
But you know what I look like, and I know what you look like, so hopefully that's okay. In fact, funnily enough, you really historically should start with the ILO, I think, if we're talking about indigenous people's rights, and we're looking a little bit at the history, but I'll let you say something about that, Lee. My comments, actually, I'm not sure what I wrote in the chapter, to be honest, but if they're about the UN, let's say something that is more or less what's there. We're echoing, is that right? This is some kind of making some kind of music.
Maybe Lee, I don't think we can turn on this.
Yeah, it's going.
Yeah. Okay, let's proceed.
Okay. Well, I think in the chapter, as far as I imagine, we start with the what happened internationally with indigenous peoples. It more or less starts in 1982, which is not it's not so distant from the discussion we just had on Latin America, where we have a similar kind of opening of democracy after a long period of dictatorships, and then this period of opening up for various rights, and so on. And I think one of the things that I would remark to you is that there seems to be a real range of communications between what happens internationally and what happens nationally. There's a real communication. What is picked up somewhere back in Colombia or Mexico or Australia or United States is then used back into the international system. The international system then feeds it back into the international systems. One of the things you notice, at least I noticed when I was there, is this kind of reciprocity of things being learnt in different organs and different spaces. I used to believe that the work that was done at the UN was extremely important. I have a little bit of doubts now, maybe 30 years later. But let me start with the positive things and just identify what I think are at least 3 major achievements from the UN system. And let's start with the most important, which is the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I think the first thing to say is that you have to believe that this was not the most obvious thing to get through the UN. This did not start off as a project which had a very easy beginning. There was a lot of resistance from governments. There's an enormous resistance from so-called human rights experts, right up into the very last when they were holding back against this principle of self-determination. So it wasn't an easy task. Most experts, when they were told that this was a necessary development internationally, would argue that there is sufficient international instruments to protect human rights and we don't need anything else, and therefore let's use those rather than develop something completely new and different. That wasn't the case, as we know. Over a long period, at least 10, maybe 12 years, there was a discussion of a declaration at the level of what is called a working group of experts. We'll see how expert they were, but anyway, they were experts. The experts in the room were probably the indigenous peoples, almost certainly. And indigenous peoples who were at that point not trained in any way to deal with the UN, and certainly not trained in the arts of some of the academic colleagues here in law and sociology and anthropology and other disciplines. They came really with stories, and from those stories one was able to develop some text, and this text to some extent was to develop over a period of time into a declaration. I would say that the first, this achievement of the declaration is important, and it's important because some of the principles are slowly being, if I can understand it, reduced in their value. When I was sitting in the UN, there was a great discussion about something called free, prior and informed consent. It's turned into something in some ways a little devalued, I would understand, particularly in Latin America, perhaps elsewhere. And the discussion seems to be much around consultation. So is that a devaluation, or is it simply understanding the concept of free, prior and informed consent differently? I don't know. But I certainly think that in the first period of this discussions around the declaration, the concept was built around consent and not consultation. And that leads me to saying that yes, there is this achievement, this fantastic achievement of a declaration adopted in 2007. Its value is, as an instrument, it's universal. We often say it's soft. I don't know what that means exactly, but it's not meant to be an obligation of states, although most states don't seem to see anything as an obligation, really. So I don't know whether that makes much difference. Nonetheless, we have a declaration. It's a soft law, so-called, but it is universal and it is adopted by all states. So it has the value of this universality, and we can argue, if you want to be moral, anyway, you can argue if governments want to be moral, if they have supported it in some way or another and voted for it at the General Assembly at the UN, then somehow or another they ought to adhere to it and implement it. One achievement, the declaration. And the declaration, I think, is a supplementary, and we can perhaps, in some discussion, think of how it complements the ILO, which precedes it quite a lot, I mean, by nearly 20 years. But has a different process, of course, in terms of its development with the participation of indigenous peoples from around the world. So this is an achievement, and it's an achievement because it contains very important elements, one of which is the right of self-determination. I'm not going to go into the detail. You have some distinguished colleagues here who've written about this, but self-determination is fundamental to indigenous people, and it exactly reflects the issues that you raised, Rachel, earlier, about how indigenous peoples feel as though they're slowly having their rights taken away with. They thought they had rights, they thought they had control over their lands and rights through the Declaration and through the ILO 169 and so forth, and they're kind of, in a way, beginning to say that this is actually maybe not quite so, and there's all sorts of manipulations going on. One big achievement is these rights, and I think it is an achievement because they did not exist before. I mean, of course, you could say some of these rights are inalienable, but for most people, these did not exist before. And that we now have a regime, a universal regime in which we can recognize that the rights of indigenous people is an extremely important development from which you can build in the future, and for which the new generation of indigenous people who will hopefully will build. The second achievement is institutional, and I don't think that has to be let's say, undervalued. I was very conscious of how indigenous people came with very little into the UN system and slowly managed to maneuver themselves through this complicated UN body and ask for everything they could possibly ask for, and very often getting it. Money to travel and criticize government, yeah, why not? Okay, here comes some money, and they do it. We want a forum where we're the boss and we're the ones that decide what goes on. Sure, okay, well, some struggles, but they have a body at a high level now in which they can discuss all matters. It's called the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Even the new Human Rights Council eventually gave a body of experts which is predominantly occupied or has a representative experts from indigenous peoples. In fact, all of the key positions now in the UN system that relate to indigenous peoples are occupied by indigenous experts of one kind or another. So this has to be seen as an achievement, or is it? I mean, and that maybe is reflecting a little bit the discussion at the very beginning about Latin America. When you've achieved something institutionally, when you've achieved, reached up kind of high levels, and when you're having this dialogue with government, when you're accepted and you have this space, have you actually achieved something necessarily? And of course we can look to see, and you mentioned Bolivia. Bolivia is a rather interesting case. Here, well, yeah, actually, indigenous peoples are up there at the very top. It's the president, right? But are things absolutely improved for the indigenous people? Certainly in terms of development, in terms of reduction in poverty, but there remain fundamental issues amongst the indigenous peoples in that region, and we have several people here who've written on that. So that is something in terms of institutions, yes, phenomenal changes internationally. From zero, indigenous people came in 1980s to the UN system with absolutely no knowledge of the UN, with absolutely nothing in terms of infrastructure apart from a little working group right at the bottom of the hierarchy of the UN system. And now you have at least 3 major institutions which are run effectively by indigenous peoples, where they can talk about issues which concern them. Of course, they can't take any decisions, which is another matter, but at least they're up there giving visibility. So this is a second, I think, achievement, but with the proviso that I mentioned, which is, well, I mean, just because we've got that, does it actually mean that we can really influence governments in the way that we want to? And then finally, the third thing, I think, and which is, I think one of the achievements as well of what happened internationally, is all about organizing. And I think organizing is quite interesting, because one of the things that I observed in my period looking at the story of the indigenous peoples, and I'm sure the colleagues who are in the UN will share that with me, is how really well organized indigenous people became in order to deal with people like myself, who was a bureaucrat, or Lee Swepston, a bureaucrat at ILO? How did they get to try to kind of figure out how the system functions and turn it to their advantage and so on? And how did they get the politics right? And I think that's something which was a very interesting learning experience for Indigenous people, something which certainly developed, something which they have used effectively in the climate, well, not effectively, but they've tried to use effectively in the climate change discussions, giving themselves a voice and a space in this new arena. And they have that experience now after developing this kind of global political network in which Indigenous peoples from around the world find a common space and a common platform, and that's something quite remarkable. You've heard about Latin America, you're quite right. There's nobody questions who is Indigenous in Latin America. Well, not really. But when you move to Africa or Asia, there's quite a lot of discussion about what is an Indigenous person in Kenya or Mali or Cameroon or any of these countries, right? So the issues are not clear. This gathering of a political force, of managing to bring people with such diverse cultures, with languages which are not shared and so on, it has to be seen as an achievement. This is my, I don't know if that's in the chapter at all, anyway. That's
more or less, yeah.
More or less, okay. That's good luck. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'd like to now welcome Lee Swepston. Julian has hopefully previewed a little bit what the ILO has contributed to this debate, but we are pleased to welcome Lee Swepston, who's had a first-hand experience of this work. And Lee, we'd like to hear from you about your chapter, Indigenous and Tribal Peoples, Culture and Work under the ILO. Please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Corinne. With Julian and me, you've got the history. We were there from about the beginning of the renewed interest in all of this when the UN system started working on it in the 1980s. But it goes back further. In fact, the ILO, which, as you know, is an older institution than the UN, was created under the Treaty of Versailles, so it existed since 1919, had been working on native workers, as the colonial workers were known at the time, and was beginning to bring in some rights for these workers back in the 30s, before World War II. By the time the UN system was established, after the end of the Second World War, the ILO had moved more toward what we now think of as indigenous and tribal peoples, that is, those within independent countries. This was on the request of the Latin American members. And the ILO did a lot of research with and on behalf of the rest of the new young UN system, which had very little experience and which had not at that time adopted any conventions. The ILO was in charge of a multi-organization effort called the Andean Indian Program, which worked very effectively, but in an integrationist framework. That is, the idea was to integrate indigenous peoples. And that was the great fault of all that we did. Well, even I wasn't there at the time, but all that was done then, which was to integrate the indigenous people. When they became us, there would be no further problems. That was the assumption at the time. But also during this period, the ILO adopted the first of the two conventions on indigenous and tribal peoples, the Indigenous and Tribal Populations Convention in 1957, which was done on behalf of the entire UN system. But then, as institutions do, it faded. Everybody lost interest. The ILO's programs dissolved. The UN had never really had any operational programs until the early 1970s, actually. I'll go back a little further than Julian, when these discussions started. This was about the time I joined the ILO and began participating in them. And as he said, the remarkable influx of indigenous peoples into these discussions, totally unprepared. We have to defend our rights, and they were evolved into this most marvelous machine that happened over the years. When the UN began discussing it, the ILO looked at its old convention and said, this is no good. It takes the wrong approach. It takes the integration approach. And these days, as indigenous organizations begin to form, we have to take a more respectful approach that recognizes their right to exist, their right to exist in their cultures, etc. And thus began the effort to revise Convention 107. This resulted, after a lot of trouble, boy, I tell you, that was hard work and great fun, and I was in charge of it at the ILO, to adopt Convention 169, Indigenous and Tribal People Convention. Now this convention doesn't have the same objective as the later declaration. It is meant, as are all international conventions, to form a baseline of rights, not to be a universal statement of everything that should happen, but to put a floor under what cannot happen. That is, consultation, not general right to self-determination. That's not in that convention, it's not supposed to be. But the idea that indigenous and tribal peoples have to be involved in the discussion. This whole idea is different from what can go into a declaration. And that's the relationship between the two. The ILO standards are the minimum standards, sometimes quite high, certainly by the standards of the time. And the declaration, which is meant to express aspirations and forms another sort of quality. Well, the two instruments together have indeed had a remarkable influence. But I'll revert to what Julian said, but I'm perhaps a little less cynical than Julian is. There are remarkable institutional developments, all of the bodies he referred to. But in addition to that, the rights and development of indigenous peoples around the world has become one of the major development focuses of the UN system, of the international system, and of the European system that funds a lot of development work around the world. The only other group that made a similar contribution, a similar inflow into the international discussions was women. With women's rights in the 1970s were hardly much of a topic, and they have become so gradually. And now everything has to take account of women's rights. This is absolutely correct. Same thing with indigenous peoples, who managed to insert themselves very successfully into the whole operation. I'm not sure how much further to go. I could talk about the effect of ratification of the ILO Convention, which has been quite remarkable in some places, much less in others. The focus in the convention, and Julian was dear friend, a little less supportive of this idea than I am. The idea of consultation has been, which is in ILO Convention 169, as the first statement of a right of these groups to participate in every decision that affects them. Has not been fully implemented almost anywhere. In a few countries, yes. But it has formed the basis for major changes at the national level. If you look at Bolivia, if you look at Mexico, if you look at Colombia, and a few other countries, even Norway, where it had a big influence, and other countries where the convention is being applied even without being ratified. And there are a number of countries that haven't ratified it but still take it as the inspiration. The idea that the indigenous people have the right to participate in the discussion is a major change from 20 years ago, where you simply would not find that recognition. And this has involved also a recognition of their existence, of their right to be themselves, and not to be integrated by force, or, as has often been the case, or even by sneakier methods, such as making it impossible for them to maintain their own institutions. Not everywhere. Indigenous peoples are still under terrible threat, and are still the occupants of almost everywhere a dam has been built in the last 50 years. That is, major development programs tend to remove them from their lands, or to put their lands and resources into danger. This is something that's in front of us that we still have to deal with. But the ILO contribution has been, I think, quite substantial, built upon by the UN example, and the participation of the indigenous peoples, not only in the institutions that focus on them directly, but also in the whole UN system development model, has been one of the most remarkable things that anybody has ever seen in international institutions. And it has changed the landscape considerably. I think I'll stop there without going too much further into detail. Any discussion, of course, I'd be more than glad to take part in. And as I say, Julie and I were there from the beginning. Delashish, I think you're there somewhere, Delashish, quite early, and has taken a vital part in all of this as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great. So we can come back to some of those UN developments in a moment, but I'd like to move now to invite Corinne Lewis. Welcome, Corinne.
Thank you.
The Corinne's working together today. Corinne has been to narrow the focus a little bit on the topic of business and human rights. Which also has important normative global developments in which the UN has played a key role. And she's going to share with us insights from her chapter, Indigenous Peoples and the Corporate Responsibility to Respect Human Rights. Welcome, Corinne, you have the floor.
Great, thank you. And I'm glad that I'm following the presentations on the UN and ILO because I think I will tie into those later on in my brief comments. I think I want to just do two things to convey sort of the basic thrust of my article. The first is to talk about the effects of development, extractive and other projects on Indigenous peoples and their rights, and then to address a development that provides potential for addressing these effects, that has really just only a stepping stone at this point. And there is a great deal more that needs to be done. So at the end, I'll highlight some further areas for research. Sort of as background, the UN Population Fund estimates that the world's population is expected to grow from the present figure of about 7.5 billion people at present to over 9 billion by 2050. And this growth will, of course, require new sources of energy, mineral supplies, food, water, timber, agricultural products. So it's not hard to see how Indigenous peoples around the world are increasingly threatened as they actually occupy and use land that contains much of the valuable resources and development potential. And you're referring to dams, for example, as projects. And these projects affect Indigenous peoples in numerous ways, and the first manner in which they affect Indigenous peoples is always with respect to their land, because the first thing that happens is that their land is taken either by government, or the government concedes the land, either sells it or leases it to a business. And so the Indigenous peoples often, of course, they don't have their legal ownership rights recognized, whether those be community rights or customary rights to the land. The communities are frequently then displaced and resettled, which then has a myriad of effects on their livelihoods and even the very existence of their community. Then another effect is oftentimes the freedom of movement of the Indigenous community, which would often be restricted with these projects. And these restrictions can then make it difficult for the community to access the vital resources they need, even such as water or the cultural and religious sites on the land that they had been using. Another effect is oftentimes the physical security of members of the community. In particular, when tensions arise between the local community and the business, when the business is concerned that the local persons and communities will object to the project, they oftentimes hire security personnel or request police assistance to ensure the safety of the business's facilities. And then, in many cases, members of Indigenous communities who speak out or take a stand against the projects face intimidation and oftentimes even worse, violence from these private security forces or the police. Another serious effect that you've probably read about in the press, certainly, is the environmental impact of a development or an extractive project. And these negative environmental impacts begin with the construction of the infrastructure for the project, and that might be the boats that are built to access the area where the project will be sited. Power, could be waste facilities, and these impacts continue through the operation of the project, and the project may entail use or treatment or storage of toxic chemicals, but even where there aren't chemicals that are being stored up on the land, effluent released from the production. Certainly, most every development and extractive project has an impact on the landscape and particularly the flora, fauna, ecosystem. So even after a project is closed, the land and the habitat remain quite scarred and may be actually impossible to restore to their previous states. Although the Indigenous communities would have likely been moved off the land. So as a result, the very land and the water that the Indigenous communities rely on for their livelihoods are polluted and endangered as a result of these projects. I should note that in mentioning the consultation and free, prior, and informed consent, I think Julian referred to, that frequently Indigenous peoples are not consulted either by the government nor by the businesses that are carrying out these projects prior to the commencement of the project, nor are they consulted during the various phases of the project where the project might be expanded or even the community may be affected in a way that wasn't foreseen at the beginning of the project. And one of the most difficult aspects is that often people are indigenous with information about the project. It presented as a sort of set of company. This will occur informing of what it will be, but they're not consulted in a meaningful way, and certainly their consent to the project is not sought for. So amidst the various that are there is a development that's relatively within the international legal structure that's influencing the accountability of businesses for negative impacts that they're having on Indigenous peoples. And this instrument, which I presume some of you are familiar with, is called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And other people refer to these as the circles worked on these.
Sorry, Corinne, Craig, may I suggest that you take off your video because it's been very distorted and we might be able to hear you a bit better if it's just audio?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, it can be amazing how poor the connection can be between Brussels and the UK. Okay, is that better?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Well, so I've given you the context for these problems. And so the UN Guiding Principles were adopted unanimously by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011. And they have this three-pillared structure that deals with the obligations of states to protect. The second pillar provides for the fact that businesses have a responsibility to respect human rights. And the third pillar is the right to a remedy for persons who are negatively impacted by businesses' activities. My article mainly deals with the second pillar the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. And I should mention that the UN guiding principles, these are not binding on businesses in any way. What they do in Principle 12, though, is make a reference to international human rights instruments and provide that businesses have a responsibility to respect human rights. And in addition to avoiding infringing upon human rights, they're supposed to address adverse impacts that their operations have on rights. Now, there are several references to indigenous peoples in, not specifically in the principles themselves, in the UN guiding principles, but in the commentary to the principles, which I think is indicative of the recognition of indigenous peoples, that they are specifically referenced in these commentaries. And businesses are encouraged to consider standards for indigenous peoples, so with reference to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the ILO Convention. But what's important is that the UN guiding principles, the second pillar, sets out a framework for what businesses are supposed to do. And this sort of structure provides, for example, that they're supposed to use a due diligence. They're supposed to assess what their impacts are on indigenous peoples. They are also supposed to put into place grievance mechanisms for indigenous peoples so that when they have negative impacts on indigenous communities, that people have a mechanism whereby they can immediately address the business and have these remedied quickly, rather than having to go through a legal process that may take a great deal of time. The businesses are also supposed to undertake consultation with affected groups, and so of course with indigenous peoples as well. There isn't any specific reference to free, prior, and informed consent in the guiding principles, but there is with respect to consultation with affected groups. And then businesses are also supposed to report on how they address their human rights impacts. Again, these I give sort of 4 examples of what businesses are supposed to do in order to ensure that they respect rights of local communities and therefore of indigenous peoples. These are not binding on businesses, but they're supposed to be guidance. But although the UN guiding principles are not legally binding, they are increasingly recognized as the global standard for conduct of businesses, and they are having an effect on other organizations and in the way that businesses are evaluated and expected to act. And so in this way, for example, the Industry Association for Mining and Minerals has guidance on actions businesses should take to respect indigenous people's rights. The World Bank and the International Finance Corporation that provide loans to governments and to businesses themselves have sections on what steps should be taken to ensure that indigenous people's rights are respected. The UN Global Compact issues a guide for businesses on respecting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So what we see is that the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, with their provisions that businesses are to respect human rights, are having positive impacts on other instruments and initiatives that then incorporate respect for the rights of indigenous peoples. And that doesn't mean, though, that in practice this is always being carried through to the field level. There are still numerous violations that are occurring of indigenous people's rights in connection with oil and gas projects, mining projects, dams, agricultural projects, such as palm oil plantations. And therefore, what really needs to occur is that, and this is what the article suggests, there needs to be much greater awareness of the impact of these projects on the rights of Indigenous peoples. And there needs to be more research to really connect up the violations that are occurring and the rights, and to really push forward with the consultation and the free, prior, and informed consent to ensure that these are not just actions that are formalities, but that they actually have substance. So there's really numerous areas in this developing field of business and human rights that need further exploration and concretization with respect to Indigenous people's rights.
Corinne, are you pausing to conclude there? Because I was going to have to ask you to wrap up.
I am.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay, great timing then. Okay, thank you very much. With a round of applause for